Hello, my name is Jerrel Dulay. I am a commercial games developer. I run a studio called Sungrand. Today I wanted to share my analysis of the cumulative effects of the Pokémon updates all the way up to the latest one, which launched along the latest DLC. So it is December 2024, and I wanted to share all of the changes that I have noticed and the reasoning behind why the developers may have implemented these changes. Now, before we get started, I just want to remind us all of the situation of when the games originally launched, Pokémon Scarlet and Violet. Now, the reason I made my original analysis video was because I was extremely disappointed with how the internet handled the launch, in that there was a significant amount of lying, in that people were using emulators to play the games, and the emulators on their computers do not have full compatibility. They will not play the game as faithfully as the game should be experienced on the console. So we were seeing a tremendous amount of glitches, which were shocking and also visually eye-catching, and people were passing these off as genuine videos of gameplay and genuine gameplay experiences when they absolutely were not. These people clearly did it for attention, which is what happens on the internet, and it was very disappointing that I saw many large YouTube channels. For example, there's a YouTuber named Young Ya. I really enjoy watching his videos. Whenever he launches a new one, I generally watch them. Very entertaining. I was extremely disappointed in his coverage of Scarlet and Violet, and he jumped on the bandwagon, and for even weeks he made multiple videos about how broken the games were, when the videos that we were seeing online and the claims were just lies. People using emulators and getting an experience that was not as you would find playing a game on original hardware. So I made my original video because I wanted to point out a more faithful representation of what the games were actually like. Yes, the games launched in a state that could have and should have been a bit better, and in my original analysis video I brought up points that the developers could have employed in order to bring some improvements to the overall experience. So that's where we are. I'm making this video now because many people have been messaging me. They thanked me for making the first video because they found it interesting. And as a game developer, I find those kinds of videos interesting. So I'm making this video to share my thoughts and to show people what I've noticed, and yeah, just to reach out to all of you and say thank you for enjoying this game with me. I enjoy hearing people talk about all kinds of games. As a game developer, I don't have much time to play games, so I haven't actually finished the story mode of this. I got most of the badges, I think, but unfortunately, right now I'm working 130 hours a week to prepare my upcoming releases to launch on the Nintendo Switch. But that's a topic that we aren't discussing in this video. So I hope you don't mind. I'll be looking at two different screens for my notes here, as I have a significant amount of notes. So I first want to discuss Update 1.1, which was significant. It was one of the biggest adjustments and patches they made to the game. So one of the biggest issues with the game in terms of performance early on with Scarlet and Violet was this culling system for dithering. This dithering system calculates how close geometry is to the screen, and then it dithers it, so it creates this screen door effect, so it kind of goes transparent. Now you might be asking, why don't they just actually make it go transparent instead of doing this screen door effect here? Well, transparency is very expensive in video games. On consoles, especially on the Switch, calculating transparency or transparent pixels is generally one of the more expensive things. So that's why we have the screen door effect here. Now, in the original launch of the game, there was a smoother transition between totally opaque and invisible, and that actually has a significant performance cost, because every piece of foliage, every piece of geometry had that. So what's going on now, and the adjustments that they've made, this is going back to 1.1, is they actually reduced the levels of transparency that there are. I think I counted maybe only 3 levels, and they removed the ability for geometry to go completely invisible. So as you can see here, this is the lowest level of transparency, and it doesn't go invisible. What's actually happening now is the polygons are clipping into the camera, and that's no longer within the camera's viewing space, so it's no longer being drawn because it's not in the camera's view anymore. So by reducing the levels of transparency, it means there's way less calculations that need to go on, and it's simpler. So I'm not sure if I'm only counting 2 stages here now. See, that's 1 stage of transparency. As I move a little bit farther, that's 2. I think that's 3. Oh, the lighting just sort of threw me off there. So, and they have adjusted this. I know that over the number of patches, this has been adjusted. So I'm going to try and very quickly get through them. Oh wow, there are so many notes here that I took on 1.1. But basically that resulted in a performance improvement. And in 1.1 we saw significant improvements that actually reduced the memory overhead. What we were seeing were a lot of visual glitches. We saw people that were sort of crashing out and texture issues. And a lot of that had to do with, as I mentioned in my first video, the game was loading in too many assets at once. It was loading in high quality assets. There was too much being loaded in. One thing I noticed as well was, say for example, the thumbnails when you go to the TM machine, it looked like all of the thumbnails were there from the very beginning, and they're always loaded into memory. Now what we're seeing here on my capture card is, my capture card is not very good, so the frame rate is quite stuttery. The visuals are not as good on my capture card. That's just what I have available to me. I'll try and update that in the future if it really matters. So this is a significant improvement they made. I'm going to go to the TM machine, and you will see for a fraction of a second, you'll see that the thumbnails are not actually loaded in. The icons are not loaded in. You'll see question marks, which means the developers have, it seems like they've changed it to where the thumbnails for those TMs are not loaded into memory all the time now. Let's have a look. And we should, if you keep your eyes open, you'll see that the icons are question marks as they're loaded in. Ah, see? You saw the question marks there? That is not something that I noticed in the original launch, so I believe that they added that in, and that really helps with alleviating memory pressure. That means that once you close the TM, they can now unload those thumbnails because you don't need them anymore. In the original version, I never saw those question marks, so I believe they added that in, and I paid very close attention to that in the original release, so I think that's something that also has a significant help as well. I'm not sure if that's the case with accessing your box as well with the Pokemon icons, because, actually I think it is. Something I noticed just then when I opened my menu, it took a split second for those icons to load in. So I believe it's possible that they added that sort of on-the-fly loading in of the assets for the Pokemon as well. I'm just going to access the box here, and please, hope you'll excuse me for a moment, as I have not played this in a long time. I worked very hard on developing my own title, so I don't exactly remember where everything is. So I'm going to open the boxes. We'll see if it takes a moment for those. Oh, it's always, actually, I think it's always been a little slow for these icons to load in, I think. I think it's always been like that. But this is the latest version, and they appear to be loading in actually a bit faster. So I think maybe that's an improvement of the latest build, because before this, I think it took a little while. It actually took longer for those to load in, so they have improved that. So what I'm assuming may be happening is it's possible that instead of loading the full resolution sprites, I believed that they were originally just using the large resolution sprites because it took a while to load them in, and I had thought that if they had used lower resolution sprites, if they had dedicated lower resolution sprites, it would make navigating this menu much better. What I'm seeing now is these are loading significantly faster, so I believe this is actually in the latest version. It may have been in the previous patch, but they are loading significantly faster. So what's possible is that they have set up dedicated lower resolution sprites so that the box now relies on the lower resolution sprites, or they may have implemented this fix in a different way. But what I do see is that these are loading significantly faster. Okay, so that is improvement. I didn't even put those on my notes because I hadn't even noticed that before. This is, I think this might be my favorite dude. This is my new dude here. Dash Bug. I love this guy's vibe. He's really fantastic. I like having him run around with me. That's my dude. Okay, something that's made it a significant improvement on performance overall, and it clears so much room. It opens up your processor, your memory budget for other things. Is there's a it appears as though they've lowered the resolution on the post-screen shader for bloom rendering. So a post-screen shader is processing that occurs after your scene has been drawn. A post-screen shader, a post-screen effect, will take that finished image and it will add something to it and calculate it. In this situation, we have something called bloom, where bloom sort of softens the edge of bright pixels and it makes things appear a bit blurry when they're bright. Very pleasing. Games have been using it for a long time, but it can be quite expensive in terms of processing. And what I've noticed is I believe they've lowered the resolution of the bloom shader in this patch, which is something that I do in my games. Now in the majority of situations, unless you're doing a side-by-side, you won't even notice that you've lowered the resolution on rendering those post-screen shaders. The only reason I can tell is because in the original version of the game there didn't seem to be a shimmering effect. As I'm trying to slowly turn my camera here, you see that shimmering on the sun? And that sort of bright halo comes from the bloom effect, the post-screen shader. And that shimmering tells me that this is a lower resolution render, which is very good, because there isn't really a reason, especially for a game like this where you're not super reliant on that for the overall experience. It was a very good idea to reduce the resolution on that. What I believe as well is they've fine-tuned the sun rays effect. They've actually amplified it so it has a stronger effect. One of the things that we expect in modern games, especially when you have an open world environment and open environments, we expect volumetric lighting. Volumetric lighting means that you have a universal lighting system that calculates and accepts, a simulated sense of depth in the atmosphere, the particles, the moisture in the atmosphere. It takes into account any lights that are in the scene, any light coming from the sun or the moon, or the ultrasun or ultramoon, how the light is filtered through clouds and fog. That's very expensive. On a PC, on hardware like PlayStation, Xbox hardware, generally it's not a big deal, but on the Switch, volumetric lighting is extremely expensive. So we can rely on techniques such as sun rays. Now these sun rays are very pleasing to the eye because they give us a sense of volumetric lighting without actually having volumetric lighting. Now the reason I can tell that there is no volumetric lighting and that it's relying on the sun rays post-screen effect for that is because when that sun is no longer in the screen, we don't actually have that sense of atmosphere and lighting. It's only when the sun is in the scene that you have that sense of atmospheric lighting. This is very good. This is a good idea. You should not waste your performance budget on a post-screen shader like volumetric lighting, as it's so expensive, and your frame rate on the Switch is going to be like fraction. It's going to be like a quarter of what it originally would be without real, true volumetric lighting. So this is great. That's very good, and they seem to have amplified that. Now I'm jumping the queue here a little bit, and I just want to go back over here and show that the developers have implemented a significant change and improvement to the way that they draw their trees and foliage. Now, what I've noticed is that, okay, the clouds have shown in, so they just ruined my example as the clouds have rolled in, but they've actually increased the effect of subsurface scattering. So when the sun is behind the trees, the trees seem to now have more light coming through. This was something that I mentioned in my first video addressing this game, and it's something that I pay extremely close attention to in my own games, is a sense of volume and depth. When light is coming through your foliage, if you just go outside and look at some trees, you'll see that the trees take in that light, and they actually absorb that light, and you can see that in the trees. Now, the original game didn't really make use of that. I'll find other trees and I'll bring this up as well, but it looks like they've fine-tuned the trees to have that strong sense of subsurface scattering with the light, where the surface is absorbing the light and the light's refracting through it, and you can see light through the surfaces. It seems that they've also increased the specularity on the trees and the foliage, so it's just like going outside and looking at some bushes. You see that they reflect the light in a very particular way. They're quite glossy, and it gives them this vibrant dimensional look to them. I have noticed that they've tuned that over the numerous patches. In this one, it seems they've improved it even further. To me, it shows that the development team really cares about the overall end experience, and it looks like they're, at this point, you know, I just want to make the note that I don't have any relation to the development team for Pokemon. I don't know anyone on the development team, so I have no communication with them. I just have all the respect in the world for the developers at Game Freak, as Game Freak are my seniors in the game industry, and they are my contemporaries and colleagues at this point, as I'm now working in the industry, and I have all the respect in the world for them. And what they've done with the patches that they've been working on just makes me respect them even more, because it shows that despite all of the criticism and really just the brutalization of what people said about this game when it first launched, it looks like they've really taken things to heart, and then they've made it as many improvements as they could, but they're not letting that sort of criticism stop them. At this point, it doesn't matter what improvements they've made to this game. It's not going to affect the sales. The sales that they've got are there. So the development team is pouring all of this effort, all of this time to make the game better. And there are things that people will not talk about. People will not talk about, wow, they've made the trees better, they've made the lighting, they've made the terrain better. People aren't going to talk about that. People won't hear that and say, I didn't buy the game before because the trees and the terrain look bad, but now people said it's a bit better, so now I'll buy the game. The developers know that. So putting in all of this effort is not going to affect their sales. They're putting in all this effort for us, the people that will still be playing the game for years and years. Now let's have a look at this tree. You can see, I believe that they've fine-tuned the subsurface scattering. You can see a lot of light coming through the trees there, and it gives us this sense of depth, and it's such a great visual effect that it makes it's little things like this that make the world feel more alive. You can see the sun rays as they sort of peek through the branches there. That's a great visual effect. It's something that they've been fine-tuning and improving overall. I better try and get through my patch 1.1 list. It's massive, and I might just sort of speed run it now. And if I can get any percent on this list of adjustments. What I've noticed as well is the 1.1 patch, the development team seems to have increased the effect of the distance fog. Now, in games we can employ fog, so we can fake a sense of atmospheric depth. We can fake a sense of moisture in the atmosphere and distance, light filtering through the atmosphere. So, like I said, you don't need to actually have volumetric lighting, because you can fake volumetric lighting. And depending on your use cases and purposes, it's a better solution because you get better performance. So you see, as I'm looking at the sun there, if I take that out of view, you can see we lose our sun rays, but you can see that it's still quite light over there. It's softer and more blue. And that's, I believe, they fine-tuned the distance fog to have a stronger effect so that the landscape looks more interesting in the distance. One visual weakness these games had on launch was the landscape looked quite dull in the distance, and it looked quite plain. I'll go ahead and fly over to this environment where I believe they've made significant improvements. Using atmospheric fog is one way to make the landscape look more interesting as it recedes into the distance. When you go outside and you spend out time indoors, you will see that. You'll see the atmosphere tends to make the landscape more softer and more blue in the distance. especially in this area, it was quite egregious where I felt that it visually was quite weak because the colors were a bit too vibrant, and I didn't see any of that distance fog to simulate a sense of atmospheric depth. I believe that is something that they've addressed here, as well as you look in the distance and it's quite soft and blue over there, so I believe that the development team is paying close attention to improving the visuals. And again, these are not things that are going to help with sales. These are not things that will make people say, oh, now I'll buy the game. The development team did this for us, the players who are enjoying the game, because I believe that they want us just to have the best possible experience with these games, because they know that we'll be playing these games for years and years. We'll be enjoying and experiencing these games for years. And I have so much respect for the developers at Game Freak who are working hard, because I can see they're putting in a lot of effort. They're putting in some real thought into improving it. And obviously they can't just revamp and redo the entire game. So they're making adjustments where they believe they can. So something I noticed as well in 1.1 is the terrain mesh geometry. It looks to have been reduced in quality overall. You can see this is quite angular here. This is something that I noticed in version 1.1 patch is the geometry of the terrain seems to be lower quality overall. Now you may think, oh, that's bad, they've made the graphics worse, but actually that is a very good thing, because this game doesn't rely on a high quality, high polycount mesh for its overall experience. We were seeing issues with memory overhead. I don't know if there was any, whatever kind of memory pressure, I don't know if there was any memory fragmentation as well. It's that, in layman's terms, it just means that your game engine is sort of playing Tetris as it's clearing up memory, and it's causing issues, because sometimes you're bad at Tetris. If you make a single mistake with Tetris, things go wrong, right? So by having lower quality geometry on the terrain, it means that it opens up more memory. There's less things that are constantly clogging up the memory. That seems to have alleviated a significant amount of memory pressure. But what I've noticed is that it does make climbing traversal a little worse, as the collision is simpler. So I've had a tougher time navigating, but overall I think this was a very good change. I have noticed that the geometry is worse. The level of detail system does appear to be more aggressive, but overall I think this is a highly beneficial change. Okay, let's see. I noticed the overall post-processing has changed in 1.1, that the graphics have actually become a higher contrast, which means the darks are darker and the brights are brighter. It seems to have a bit more of a contrasty look, a higher contrast, higher saturation, which results in a visually more pleasing experience. So I'm happy to have seen that. For me personally, I'm getting a bit sick of games that are just sort of desaturating their games to look kind of realistic. So I really like the adjustments that they've made to the increased contrast. So let me, I don't actually know, oh right, I don't actually want to be here, sorry, let me climb out of here. So there are a few things that I'm a bit uncertain about, and it's been so many months since I took these notes and saw the 1.1 patch, that there's certain things that I may just leave out because I'm not entirely confident on these changes. But let's see. Something I'm not entirely sure of here is, I think instead of letting trees render shadows or not have any shadows in the distance, I believe that they've added blob shadows under the trees at a distance, but that's something that I'm not confident about. But I think the trees in the distance, I think they didn't have any sense of shadows in the original launch, and it looked quite flat as you looked into the distance. Something that they have addressed as well is the camera clipping underneath the terrain. In my original video analyzing these games, I explained that I believe that in order to place the camera, they were using a technique called ray casting, which you're basically checking for a polygon in your game world. So what was going on, I believe they were casting one single ray downwards underneath the camera, but they weren't checking to the sides of the camera. And it was allowing the corners of the camera to clip underneath the terrain. The reason why that occurs is the camera is not one single pixel wide. The camera is actually quite wide, especially in widescreen now. So that was allowing the camera, and my recommendation was to instead of using a single ray cast down, is to use a spherical cast. A spherical cast allows you to sort of build a virtual sphere around the camera, and that lets you check for collisions. I believe they've addressed that, however they did that, whether they're casting a ray, 2 rays off to the side, or whether they're using spherical casting. They have addressed that issue so the camera doesn't clip underneath the terrain, but the camera can clip underneath the terrain during catching sequences. Now the reason why the camera can still clip underneath the terrain in battle, because there are 2 control mechanisms that we employ as we are creating our game logic. We either have programmatic camera control, which is what we see now. This is programmatic. It's controlled through the code, it's able to perform collision checks, and the player is able to control it. The other form of camera control is animation, and in general, animation does not take into account programmatic logic, and so when we are in battle, the animation control system takes over. So the programmatic camera control system takes a break, the animation control system says, let me handle this, I've got this, hold my camera for me. And the animation system doesn't check the terrain. And the animation system does things like when your character is performing I sound like an old person. Your Pokemon is performing an attack. That animation control system takes over and says, zoom the camera around, do this. When you catch the Pokemon, the animation logic takes over and it says, let me do something cool with the camera here. It's not checking for any collisions. Which it's kind of complicated and difficult to implement and to make those 2 systems sort of to share a steering wheel. It's kind of like you've got a friend in the driving seat. Like, do you both want to use the steering wheel? Do you want to let your friend, control the steering wheel while you're driving? It's complicated, and some unpleasant things can happen in that situation. So let's see. Something I've noticed with shadows as well is they've actually changed the ways that shadows are being rendered. So this is actually in the latest version now. This list is so long. Okay, so in the latest patch, in the most recent patch, this was in the patch before this one. So what happened with the shadows previously is they were using a form of soft shadows, but that's actually quite expensive to render. And what we've implemented, or what we've seen implemented now, is more pixelated shadows that are harsher. And these harsher shadows are actually a bit cheaper to render. So there's less rendering overhead, which adds some performance back into your budget. So that's something I have noticed, is that the shadows are actually harsher, but they use this sort of staggered shadow so that the edges can be kind of softer. But that's something I noticed. So technically they're lower quality shadows, but overall it contributes to better performance. And I think it was the right decision to make, because it's, again, you're not relying on highly detailed, super soft shadows for this game. They don't contribute to the core experience of that. They're just icing on the cake. And that means that everything in the environment, instead of contributing to slower performance, they have less impact on the overall performance. Like, the more things you have rendering shadows. So switching to that harsher, more pixel shadow as opposed to a softer shadow, I think was a good idea. Let's see. So this is still 1.1. Something I've noticed, and again, this is on 1.1, and I'm not sure if they've adjusted this again further. I feel like they have adjusted this further, is the adaptive resolution. So adaptive resolution means that the game can sort of tell when its frame rate is suffering, and it will lower the frame rate accordingly to try and maintain some of its performance. Performance has kind of always been an issue here. And that's always going to be an issue with games, is we just want to put as much as we can into our games. But I think with the latest patch, they've fine-tuned it even further, where the resolution will drop even more to try to reserve their performance. So I'm just sort of, let's see here. Something I've noticed is terrain edges, this is going back to 1.1, have more tiling, and they tend to have more contrast. So the darks are darker, the brights are brighter, and I've noticed this in many situations. In the previous patch, I've noticed complete texture replacement, or changing the way that they've tiled, and I don't know if they're using any secondary layers on their terrain, but they they have redone the terrain, and it overall just looks significantly better than the original version. The terrain looks better from a distance, and it looks better up close. There appears to be a higher pixel density, and I'll go over that sooner. But something that I want to point out that I have noticed in this patch now is that we no longer have, for the vast majority of Pokemon and human characters, their animations no longer drop to a stuttering frame rate at a distance. You can see that there's probably only one level of detail for the animations I saw on that NPC there, that once they got far, I noticed their frame rate is now, it seems to have dropped a bit, but it's no longer really terribly noticeable. It just dropped another level of frame rate, but it's no longer egregious. This is something that they have addressed, and I just noticed it in this patch, is something they've improved significantly, that it looks much better than it did before. Again, there's no reason for them to do this. It doesn't help with sales. It's not going to make anyone go and fix their reviews of the game. It's just for us. It's for you and it's for me. People that are actually enjoying this game will be playing this for years and years, and they know we'll be playing this for years and years. So the developers did this because they actually care about the end experience for us. At this point, they're not doing it for sales or reviews. The developers are doing it for us, which is why I really respect Game Freak for what they've done here. So, this is something that I noticed in the previous patch, is they have redone their baked lighting. The baked lighting indoors now has more contrast and more saturation, which means the shadows are more intense and darker, and the lights are now brighter. Now, unfortunately, I don't have two switches here. I can't show you side by side. I do have some screenshots that I took, but that would take some time for me to actually organize them, put them all together. And I'm not a reviewer, I'm not a YouTube content creator, and this is not what I do for a living. My job is making my own video games, so I have to take a fair chunk out of my my work day, to create these videos to share with you. But before the previous patch, the shadows were quite soft under that, the lights were a bit dull. What they changed in that previous patch is the shadows indoors, which are called bake lighting. They bake the lighting into the environment, and it saves on the rendering, because it means they don't need to render the lighting in real time. So it's a performance consideration. Is they've done that, redone it completely, and it looks noticeably better. If you may have noticed something and you weren't sure and you were wondering if you were crazy, you're not crazy. They have redone the lighting. I'm not sure if they've done it for every single environment indoors, but I have noticed it, especially here, is that the lights are just significantly brighter, there's more contrast, and the shadows are darker. There appears to be more saturation as well. This is a change that I really like, and again, it's such a small detail. Why do it? Why do that if it's not going to get you, it's not going to make people revise their reviews or adjust sales? They're doing it because I believe the developers want to make the best game they possibly can. What I have noticed as well, this goes back to 1.1. Wow, there's the changelog is huge for 1.1. The water, let's see. So the shader that they use for rendering water, I believe the water reflections now render at a lower resolution. So let's go ahead and zip on over. I believe I'm fairly confident on this. I spent a lot of time looking at this. I believe that the reflections of the water are lower resolution, and this really contributes to improved performance. This really helps. So how reflections on water works is you basically have the game rendering a virtual camera, and the virtual camera is pointed at the water a certain way, and it says, okay, show me what the scene looks like, and then we'll sort of project that onto the water, so we can create a reflection. Because reflections aren't real. None of this is real. These aren't real reflections. We don't really have atmospheric lighting. We don't really have, moisture in the atmosphere. Those are not things that they don't exist. They're not actually happening. We're creating that sense. We're creating that effect. So what we're doing is we're just rendering the camera at a particular angle, projecting it onto the water. But that's quite expensive. Anything that's in the scene, any pixels that contribute to it, any fog, any transparent pixels contribute to that. So what I've noticed is if you have a look at the resolution of my Pokemon there, this guy, I'm so busy right now and I don't have time for this. The resolution is significantly lower than it was in the original, and it contributes to improved performance. I think when you get a little closer to the water, see, there are two things going on here. There's that, and then you see where there's distortion. Now the resolution on those distortions, that seems to be a bit higher. But if you look at that base reflection there, that's significantly lower resolution. You see the pixel density is quite lower. That's a good change because, again, you just need to create a sense of reflections. Having high-quality reflections is not vital. That's not a huge contributor to the overall experience of this game. This game's called Pokemon. It's not called Water Reflections. So I think this is a good change that they've implemented as well. And again, the stuttering frame rate is a fair bit of that comes down to my graphics card. It's not a great graphics card. But you can see that the frame rate is suffering a bit than when I was in other areas. If I get away from the water, let's see I think it's a bit better now that I'm farther from the water here. Okay, I'm not sure if the flower geometry and textures that we see on the terrain has been simplified. I think there's a possibility that the poly count on the geometry on that has been simplified and reduced. But again, it was so long ago. Let's see. So what I have noticed, this goes back to 1.1, and I'm not sure again if they've addressed this or not, and made adjustments, is that textures, when it's at an oblique angle, they're much lower resolution, and it's possible that we're using a lower quality texture filtering. So, for example, there's different kinds of texture filtering we can use in games, and texture filtering generally occurs when we need to view polygons that are textured at an angle. We can use bilinear filtering, which is the most basic, which sort of softly blends them. We can use trilinear, which is a little bit more expensive. There's more things we can do. We can use anisotropic filtering, which makes it look really nice. And there are things called MIP maps as well, and it will draw lower resolution versions of those textures when you view it at an angle. So just looking at this now, I feel like they may have improved that a bit. I'll head back into the city, because in previous versions I did notice that there was lower quality on that, and it may have been to possibly alleviate memory pressure if there's going to be lower I don't know if they've lowered the resolution bias on their mipmaps, but the filtering is overall lower quality, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So I'm gonna zip on over. I'll find an environment where I thought I had noticed it. Right. Let's see here. So hop off my dude. You can see. So when I view the game at this angle of the world, those textures you see on the ground. I'm looking at the ground here. They're quite blurry, right? Especially right here. They're very blurry. Now, in the original launch, that was actually quite more sharp and detailed, and it didn't look that blurry. Now, when you get, especially over here, that's even more blurry. I believe they may have adjusted their bias for this filtering so that it's lower quality, and whatever texture filtering they're doing is lower quality, because overall you get a performance boost if you use lower quality texture filtering. Again, I think this is a very good call, because again, nobody is really going to complain about something like that. And again, having like extremely high quality texture filtering at a super oblique angle, I don't think people will raise an army over something like that. So in the original launch, I believe these filtering looked a bit better because the game spent more processing time filtering. I think they've reduced the quality on that filtering in exchange for some performance. So that's possible. But again, that was in 1.1 and other versions that they've, and the previous version, they also adjusted that as well. In this latest version, maybe they've improved it somewhat. This is something that I didn't notice in the original launch day version, but it may have been that maybe I just didn't play the game enough, is if you fall from a particular height, there's now an event that occurs that the game, your Rotom, will ask you, do you want to return to where you were previously? I did not notice that in the launch day version of the game. I noticed it in version 1.1, and I believe if they did add that in, in 1.1. I believe it's in response to people that were getting stuck on geometry. So say, for example, where am I going now? Did I go outside? I don't know what I've done. I think I've gone outside. People were sort of getting stuck in certain places, and they weren't able to escape. So what I believe if they did add that in 1.1, I believe the reason being is that if your character is constantly checking for the ground now, and if they are not able to detect that they're touching the ground, if they're stuck in a state where they're falling after a certain amount of time, the game will do that as a failsafe, and it will say, do you want to return to where you were previously, the last place where the game detected you were touching the ground. So if they did add that in 1.1, that's the reason why. People were getting stuck in the original launch. We weren't seeing that Rotom asking to save you. So I believe that was in response to people having a negative experience getting stuck. So I'm going to use my mouse here, and now I'm going on to my next document. I sort of speed run that any percent. I think I only got like, 50%, but I sped run that document. So, let's see. I'm trying to go over, I'm looking at my document here. There's quite a few things where I'm second guessing myself. Because I'm not on this development team, so I don't know exactly what they've done. I can only lend my eyeball to see what I believe they've changed and what I can perceive. I'm sure they're making so many other changes that we don't even notice. The default camera in the previous version patch, the default camera is now zoomed out more. There are now options to have the default camera zoomed. Let me try to access those. I'll go to my menu. We now have, so this is something they've added, camera interpolation. It says you can slow the interpolation speed when the camera makes sudden large movements. I believe they added this to try to address if the camera's sort of jittering back and forth. They wanted to sort of alleviate motion sickness. I personally could not see a situation where I could notice myself the difference. But what I do know for a fact that is very visible is camera distances that you can now change. Let's go ahead and go to far. I do want to save these settings. And now you can zoom out real far, and I really like this, that you can zoom out like this, because you could make the game feel like a traditional 2D Pokemon game. Obviously not 2D because the camera's moving around, but there's another option they had added here. So I'm pressing left, right? I'm pressing left, right. Turn left, right. Who's on first? I'm holding right, and you can see my character turns to the right. This is something they've added in the previous patch here. Is horizontal camera controls. Oh wait, no, that's not it. What am I, okay, hold on. Regular, no, that's not it. There's something else they added here. Camera support on, I think camera support off. I'm turning off camera support. This is what they've added as well in the previous patch. So I turn off camera support. If I press left, you can see the camera no longer turns. And I really like this. I don't know why they've done this. I don't think anyone was asking for this. But it makes the game feel like an older 2D Pokemon, because you can now zoom the camera out, and if you turn off that camera support, the camera no longer turns when you press left and right on the control stick, and you can have the zoomed out overhead look, and I just like this. I don't watch a whole lot of YouTube videos about the Pokemon games, so I don't know what other people are saying about these games. I don't know if anyone's talking about this, but it's something that I wanted to bring up because I think it's really great. It's so neat. So I really like that feature. So I will go back to my options. And now for camera distance. Oops. On camera distance, we'll put that on close. Okay, and we'll see the distance. And you can see now when the camera distance is on close, that's as far as I can get the camera. So, and there's the difference that we have. This is really neat. I quite like that. I think I've accidentally inverted my camera controls, which is hurting my brain box. I did accidentally invert that. So, and I'll show you again, I'll leave camera support off. So I'm going to press left, and you can see that my camera no longer moves. So I have to rely entirely on my analogs, or my right analog stick, to move that. So, in general, I'm so used to having the camera support on that it's I kind of like having it, but I think I'd like to get used to having it like this now. So I think I'll just leave that off. That's a really great feature that they added in the previous patch. Okay, so I believe, let's see here, lower quality, cloud shadows are, so the cloud shadows that we see on the terrain, these are not real shadows, they're basically what are called blob shadows being projected onto the terrain geometry. They're quite basic, which means that they're pretty easy to process. They don't actually take into account any kind of light or lighting. And so what I've noticed is that in the previous patch, they are rendered at a lower resolution. And in general, shadows are rendered at a lower resolution. So have a look at the shadows there. Even they're quite pixely. That means that shadows, whatever's going on there, anisotropic filtering is a much lower quality for the textures as well. But so we rely on, that's not what I was talking about just now. I don't have any clouds right now, but they are, well, no, see, that's kind of doing my head in a little bit. I don't know if because that's stuttering right, I'm not sure if they're just sort of rendering that out every second. That may be actually a baked shadow that they're just rendering out every 1 second, because when you view it, to me, that looks like a lower quality anisotropic filtering, which is what we see on the clouds as well. Sorry, I gotta pick this guy up. So that's something that they would have done again as a performance consideration, and again, a good idea, very good idea. Let's see. In general, though, that means that the shadows from the clouds are prettier up close, and shadows overall, they're going to be a little bit better looking up close, and then farther away, they're going to be a bit less pleasant to look at. No big deal. I think it's a good idea to make these kinds of considerations. Something I noticed as well, I believe the shadows have a little bit of a bluish tint to them in the previous update. So there have been significant changes to the lighting in the previous Scarlet and Violet update. I believe that the lighting, the colors are now more intense, which means that instead of having like using white as a sunlight color, for example, they've actually made the light more saturated, and it makes the geometry of the terrain look way more interesting. I believe the shadows are now more interesting because they have a little bit of a bluish tint to them, which gives a sense of atmospheric depth and atmospheric influence. Whether or not they've made these changes through a post-screen shader or whether they've made other adjustments to the lighting system, I'm not sure how they implemented it, but the lighting overall, as of the previous update, it's significantly more interesting. Okay. Something I noticed is that the terrain's basically been overhauled as of the last update, and here's a good chance to see it, is the terrain now has more specular, not reflection, it has more specular value to it. So you can see that it's actually catching the moonlight, and it's reflecting that moonlight, and it gives it a sense of depth. There's a higher pixel density when it comes to the normal map, which is the bumpiness of the terrain, the way that it catches the light, and the way it sort of gives a sense of depth and shadows. If I change the angle at which I look at the terrain, you can see that it's now there isn't that specular shininess because I'm viewing at it from a different angle. This is something that they've been fine-tuning and improving. I think they've improved it even more in this update, but again, I can't speak much to that as I don't have two Switch consoles with different versions. But you can see that the ground now reflects the light of the moon. That particular part of the terrain, that rock, is more specular. It's quite shiny. And if you look at the grass doesn't have that, so it adds contrast in the terrain, and it makes the terrain just visually more eye-catching. It's so much more interesting now. It's especially noticeable during the daytime, but during the night you can see that it's way more interesting. They have changed the textures that they're using. They're more higher resolution textures, but it's not just that. I don't know if they're using some sort of stochastic tiling or tessellation, or what they're, not tessellation, I don't know if there's any kind of like parallax effect or anything going on here. But they're employing now some sort of programmatic technique or shader technique to where the geometry of the terrain, the textures of the terrain look more interesting because they're more varied from a distance. It no longer looks like this mindless tiling from the N64 days. There is something going on here that sort of splat maps a larger texture, so from a distance now it looks like there's more variety. This is something that's a challenge. It's so difficult in games, and I'll show you some examples from my game coming up to help explain what's so difficult about it and why it really helps. But overall, they put so much effort into fine-tuning and improving the terrain, and again, I think it's things that people generally wouldn't even care about or notice. It's not the kind of thing where it's like, yeah, now I'll buy the game because they've made the terrain a little bit better. This is significantly better than what it was on launch day. There's so much more normal value to the terrain, and I'll show you a little bit of some of my work to show you what I mean. Is that the normal data allows the ground to look bumpy. I've noticed that when the light hits even the grassy areas, there's more normal value. It's normal intensity. Just have a look at that. If you watch any gameplay video from the first version of Scarlet and Violet, it looks much more flat. So, and that is the result of having more intense normals, higher quality or higher resolution normals, higher resolution textures. And the reason they're able to have higher resolution normals and detail maps is because they've made concessions in other parts of the game. That means that they've reduced the memory overhead, they've reduced the memory pressure. There's less things in the game that are taking up memory all the time, which allows them to have higher resolution textures. They can now have better normal maps. They can now have higher resolution, which means less tiling. They can layer things onto the terrain to make it look better. And these are things that show me that these developers really do care about the game that they've made, and they do want to make the best game that they can make, given whatever circumstances under which they have to develop the games. Here's a situation where you can see a little bit more tiling that's visible, which tells me that this is not a universal change that they've implemented. These are things that they've handcrafted. They've gone through the entire terrain by hand. They've painted terrain details to help add more detail to it. I believe, as of this version, they may have done some degree of baking ambient occlusion onto the terrain, because I have noticed areas where you see dark patches and light patches that are not influenced by the real-time lighting, which to me tells me that they baked some ambient occlusion in an attempt to make the terrain walls look more interesting. So I do applaud them for the efforts that they've done here. It has made a significant difference. You have things like this where those walls now look significantly more interesting than they did in previous versions. In this one, there's still visible tiling, and I believe it's because, again, that wall is probably, it's not one that people are going to look at that often, and I know for a fact that when the light hits that from a different angle, you would see more detail that they would have added, and you would see much less of that tiling. A lot of that has to do with because it's in the shadow, so we're not seeing a lot of the normal data that they've added to that. Okay, so I'm gonna see if I've addressed everything. Oh, I scroll down and my document keeps going. There we go. Loading is faster. As of the previous version, loading going from area to area is actually about a second faster that I've noticed when you, say, fly and switch to a different area. So, hey, thanks for making the game a bit better. You may think that doesn't matter, but any improvement to loading times matters, you know. And it's appreciated. Even if it's only a second, honestly, it is appreciated. So loading is faster, which to me tells me that it's possible that they've optimized the default quality meshes that are loaded into an environment. It means that by default we're now loading in more lower quality meshes, which are faster to load into memory because they take less memory, and we are loading in lower quality textures by default, which means we're not like even loading in the higher quality textures until we need them. So they've done significant work. Even if it only gets a second, it shows me that they are trying to optimize what's going on here. Okay, so yeah, overall I see that there is more there's more attention paid to the visual aesthetic of the terrain. I've noticed that the colors have been adjusted to be more visually pleasing. So the game, it doesn't even look like what it looks like on launch day. I think it's significantly better. They have manually adjusted all the colors on the terrain, on all the textures. I noticed there is less complexity from wind animation on vegetation. So things like the trees blowing in the wind, the bushes here, the grass, something I've noticed, I don't know, because I spend so much time developing my own games, I'm not playing this that much. Again, I haven't even finished the story mode. But what I did notice in the previous patch is I believe there's lower quality wind effect on the foliage. Something I see in the grass, I think the grass is, the animation for blowing in the wind is more basic now. This is something that does help significantly with processing time. This isn't about, well, I don't know what methods they're using in general, if they're using like GPU grass or whatever, but in general you need the CPU to process things like the wind blowing. But again, I don't know what techniques they're using in this game. But in general, I believe they did that to alleviate pressure on the CPU. And by alleviating pressure on the CPU, because the wind quality is now lower quality, I believe that opened up some budget, some performance budget, to now allow things like the characters that are walking in the distance, Pokemon in the distance, now have higher quality or higher frame rate animations. It's possible that they made that performance consideration with the wind quality. They have reduced the wind quality so that they can make a trade-off and have better quality, higher frame rate character animations. So I believe that's where that is. Okay. Something that I noticed in the previous version is that water, I believe they're using a different water shader altogether. Whatever shader they're using for their water, as of the last version. Oh, I didn't even notice that. I wasn't reading. I'll just use my friend here. Okay. He's ground type. Why does that say effective? Why does that say effective? He's... What? Oh, wait, no, he terrestrialized to rock type, didn't he? My brain is kind of focused on my notes here. I'm very sorry, I just went back to gamer mode there for a second and my brain just grinded gears. Right, so, yeah, I believe the shader that they're using for rendering water, I believe, is a totally different shader, and it looks better. I don't know if they're maybe using the same shader and they've just made adjustments to it. I ran straight into another one today. I don't know if they've actually made adjustments to their existing shader. I'm just button mashing at this point, aren't I? They've made significant changes to the water shader, whether or not they're using a totally different one or they've revised their original one, but it looks better. I believe the water looks noticeably better. Okay, so something I've noticed with the Terra Raid battle particles, generally there's a lot of particle effects going on with the Terra Raid battles. What I've noticed, I believe they've simplified the particle effects. What I've noticed is the particle effects actually look less dense. There's less density with the particle effects. I don't know if they've actually changed the particle effects to have less transparency, but in general, the more particles you have, the more rendering time that you need to spend. I'm ready to go. See if I can point it out. But what I have noticed is that improves performance. The less particles you have on screen, because again, transparent pixels, transparent polygons, transparent effects are generally the most difficult thing for the Switch hardware to render. They're the things that slow it down the most. Particle effects like there, when it first spawns, you can see that for a while you could actually see the lower polycount versions of my partners. They were visible for quite a while, so to me it shows me that they've paid a fair bit of attention loading in lower quality meshes first and then loading in the higher quality ones later. I believe it's possible that they're staggering, if they've introduced just like a This is what I would do as a developer. I don't want to waste my next ball on it. I didn't actually want this. These particles that we're seeing now are significantly simplified. These also as well. I have noticed them in the previous patch. I believe they fine-tuned them so there's less particles, so that it's easier for the game to render. Maybe I'm just going crazy, but I'm fairly confident they've optimized and reduced the complexity of the particle effects here for better performance. Okay. Oh, something I've noticed. I've got a note here. It says sparkling swirl despawns after a while. Yeah, I've noticed that. So you know when you have the Terra Raid Pokemon there, I don't know if this is a glitch that they know about, the development team, but there's a lifespan on that, and if you wait long enough, that swirl actually disappears. I think it might be 1 or 2 minutes. It may be a glitch, but the swirl does disappear if you sit and wait. In the previous patch, the distance at which your mount can go invisible was changed, so you ran into less situations where your character was floating in the air like this. I don't know if they've revised it again. It's possible they may have adjusted it, but in the previous version I noticed that I found way less situations where my mount was going invisible. In this, I don't know if they've changed it again, so I'll get him to go invisible, and you can see I actually have to go a fair while before he comes into being visible again. So I believe, this is something that I'm just noticing in this patch, what I believe is going on is, well, I actually noticed this a fair bit less, and I'll get into a battle. What I've noticed is I think they're staggering their distance check to the camera. So in previous versions, if you got too close to the Pokemon, they would sort of very smoothly transition into being invisible. But I believe that they're now staggering that distance check. But I could be wrong again. I haven't spent so much time, but you can see that isn't very smooth, the way that it fades through the stages of dithering. You can see how it sort of steps a little bit. I think it steps through 3 stages before it goes invisible. I believe that is so it reduces the processing overhead. Because as I said, every single thing in the scene has to check its distance to the camera. Every clump of grass, every foliage, every Pokemon, everything. By staggering that distance check, you're alleviating a significant amount of processing pressure. So that's great. This is great. What I haven't noticed in this version of the game after this patch, and again, I haven't played it enough yet. But again, like I said, I've been working 130-hour work week. I'm launching, for the foreseeable future, for this 2024, I'm launching around 1 new game a month. So I have a significant amount of work to do. What I haven't noticed in this patch is geometry going invisible while it's off camera, causing the shadows to disappear. I'm not sure if they have addressed that, or if it's just something that I haven't played this version enough to test. But it's something that has occurred significantly and noticeably in previous versions, even in the last patch. So I think that's all the notes I have for the previous patch. Let me go ahead and have a look. I took some notes last night. And let me zoom on into my notes here so I don't squint at them like I'm old. Okay, so yeah, I believe they've just improved the trees even further. They really pop now. The foliage overall really pops. I think it's much more interesting visually now. The terrain, texture, pixel density, I think it again has improved in this patch. Whether or not I'm just haven't played the game enough, or I'm remembering it a bit wrong, or if I missed some updates, they improved it in previous updates. But the texture, the pixel density has increased. When I think some of it may have to come down to being able to zoom the camera out. I actually quite like it on far. Is if your pixel density is low, it means that you have to tile your textures more, and if you have to tile your textures more, they look really bad from far away. And because the camera is now allowed to be far away, I believe they've paid extra attention to making sure they look good. You know, things like this I think just look great. I think that looks fantastic. You can see we now have, you can see the cracks in the rock, they reflect, and then because cracks are in the shadows, they don't reflect. It just adds that extra bit of dimensionality. Very pleasant to the eye, really fantastic. Here. So I don't know if they've revised the mud puddles in the rain. I took a note there, but it was late at night. It was like 1 a.m. and I was taking notes on this. I'm not sure if they've revised the sort of puddles in the rain, if they've improved them. Something about them looked a little bit different to me, but I couldn't quite place my finger on it. But I do know that in this version they have revised the screen door transparency. Again, I think it has to do with the staggering, the way that it checks the distance to the camera. Something about it, again, looks different to me, but I, again, 100% can't quite put my finger on it. But I know that these all come down to performance implications and performance considerations. Let's see. I just feel like the terrain has way more specularity in this version. I'm not sure if they've added any new details. Like, there were situations where I was noticing, like, roots sticking out of the ground, like terrain roots, and I'm not sure if those were always visible, or if that's something they've added recently. Little things like this, I'm not confident. I don't confidently recall those being in the original version. But again, it's been so long, and I've spent so much time. I'm so buried in my own development that I'm staring at my own work. So I may not be remembering these things fully. And if I didn't really take notes on it in a detailed way, then please excuse me if I get that wrong. The lens flare effect, I believe, I'm not sure if they've intensified that, but it is a bit more noticeable. But it makes scenes like this just look so much better, so much more interesting. I'm not sure if there's a distance blur going on. There seems to be some degree of distance blurring, which I didn't notice. I'm not really seeing it here on the console mode, but in handheld mode, I was noticing there seemed to be some sort of filtering. I'm not sure, again, if it's a performance implication where they're trying to hide things in the distance. But I know that they have put in significant work making considerations for performance. There, that wall you can see does look better once the lighting is hitting it a certain way. You can see the large details now. I was noticing more dark grassy patches. Again, I'm not sure if I'm remembering that correctly or not. Let me go ahead and fly over to somewhere where I thought I noticed them last night. I'll go ahead and fly on over here. Okay. Yeah, I just think it's so great to see so many changes that are they're really noticeable. They're significant improvements, and it's not just for performance. There's so many things that are implemented to just increase the overall performance. Yeah, and I think that, the adjustment of the resolution, the adaptive resolution, is more aggressive. I think it's willing to dip down a bit lower just to preserve the frame rate. So that's really great. That affects slowdown when the slowdown is caused by things that are putting pressure on the GPU, the graphics processing unit. But here's where things can sort of go wrong. That adaptive resolution, I don't think it takes into account if your performance bottleneck is coming from the CPU. Which is why I think we've seen things like lower quality wind animation and other things of that nature. I'm not sure if there is a height fog going on at this point, but there are things that I've noticed. You can see the blending at this point. You can a sort of a distance blur effect in the distance. You can see it along the edges there. That's noticeable, and you can see there is some effect of height fog, which I'm not sure I've noticed before. But you can see there is a fog that occurs, between there and there, but any higher, it doesn't show above that. So it may be something they've added, or something that I just didn't notice before. It's possible that they've added that just to look better. These dark patches, again, I just haven't been playing this game like non-stop consistently. I normally, spend a lot of time with these Pokemon games, but I'm so busy with work that there isn't really any game that I get to play much these days. And hey, I'm just trying to remember as much as I can. These sort of dark patches, I don't really recall these as being as prominent. I don't know if they're adding more, or if they've made them more intense. they do make the landscape look more interesting. And I would really like to go back and, if I could just get version 1 of the game, to see if these are in there, if they're as prominent. But they look interesting. They help the landscape look more interesting and varied. Let's see. And I think there's one more thing that I'd really like to point out here. So I think I've basically covered all of the revisions that I've seen. It's huge. It's so massive. And there are just a few more things that I want to address, even outside of the adjustments that they've made, because this is significant. The work that they've done is so significant, and it makes me want to play the game again. But unfortunately, I don't have that kind of time with my workload. So I'll sleep on out there anyway. So what I've noticed, I'll need to gain some height here. What I have noticed is the game is not using billboards for trees in the distance. Now the reason why I bring this up is if you are... Every single design consideration you make has an impact on the rest of the components in the game. Because they are not using billboards in the distance, it means that trees are actually still have a performance cost that's quite noticeable in the distance. And if you are not using billboards, it means you're drawing geometry. And geometry still has to calculate lighting. You have polygons that you have to render. It's taking account into all of those things. It means that you have to have less tree density. Having less tree density means you have kind of sparse-looking landscapes. Now, I'm not going to say anything negative and say that the game looks sparse, but I would describe this as not having many trees. And I'll point this out here. So this landscape, if you look at it, there aren't really that many trees. And these... I paid so close attention to this last night. I was really trying to point it out. It does not appear as if these trees are using billboards, because even though they look flat, they're actually using just significantly lower resolution textures. I was running around at different angles in the distance. I was up pretty late last night trying to figure this out. I'm fairly confident saying they're not using billboards. And that, I mean, realistically, you can count the number of trees that are in the scene, and that is because the trees are still expensive to draw at a distance, so you cannot have that many trees. You can visibly see, you could count these trees, you know, and I believe it's true with all the foliage. Means the foliage does not use billboards. And I'm going to now switch over to something that I'm working on that I'll be launching either in late January or early February. So if you'll please excuse me, I'll switch over to some of my work to help illustrate the point here. Okay. So this is... The product that I'm showing you is a remaster of a 3DS game that I've developed. You can see that it employs the sun ray or a sunbeam sort of effect to simulate a sense of atmospheric lighting. I put in significant attention into the subsurface scattering, so please don't mind that yellow lens flare is a little bit erroneous. I need to adjust that. But you can see as the light comes through the trees, the leaves, you can see the leaves absorbing the light, and you can see the light through the leaves. This is something that's very important to me. I love spending a lot of time outdoors, and I really want my trees and games to look right. So ignore that yellow spot, that needs to be revised. But you can see the sun rays coming through the leaves. It gives that the sense of depth and moisture in the atmosphere. The leaves are illuminating. Let's see here. Especially with the cedar trees as well, you can see the light coming through the leaves. It's the very edges that should be the brightest because they are exposed to the sunlight, so they're picking up light from the other side. You're seeing light coming through the branches, whereas in the middle of that tree you see less of that because again there's sort of they're being blocked. You know, the branches sort of blocking the light from coming through. So I'm going to turn around here, and this is still quite early in development. There's still quite a bit of work I need to do on the landscape. There's the tiling issue that you see in the landscape, and it's such a challenge, and you have to make considerations, and you have to sacrifice performance of other things in order to get that to look decent. So you can see these trees here are all rendered with meshes. These are mesh geometries, and there's a cost. There's a real cost to that. There's a lot of calculating the wind. They calculate all the lighting, all the shadows. Shadows are being cast upon them. They are also casting shadows. But if you have a look out into the distance, this is quite a dense forest. There are bushes. There's all different kinds of trees out there. You can see very far into the distance. Even out on that hill, you can see those red trees, those maples. So we don't see anything like this in the Scarlet and Violet. And there's one area where that's quite dense with foliage and trees. I don't know the name of it off the top of my head, and the frame rate absolutely suffers in that area. It's crawling. The frame rate is at a crawl. And the reason I'm able to achieve, I'll swing my axe, and you can see I've still got a smooth frame rate here, and I have thousands upon thousands of trees, bushes, and all kinds of foliage being drawn in this, and I'm maintaining honestly, it's a very smooth frame rate. Those are billboards, which means they consist of one quad, two triangles. I'm using billboards with texture data that have normal data. There's normal data on the billboards, which means that they can at least receive some sense of dimensionality so they can show where light is coming from. I have these shaders set up in a very specific way so that they can actually also express a sense of subsurface scattering. So they can actually absorb light from the sun or the moon. They can have light coming in from the moon, and they can show light showing through that. So even from a distance, these billboards don't look bad. I rely on global fog to build a sense of atmospheric density and depth, so that actually shows, it hides the fact that they're just flat billboards, but because I'm using billboards, I can have a significantly more detailed environment, and there's thousands upon thousands. Now, these are not statically batched. You might think, oh, well, Jerrel's able to achieve that frame rate because they're statically batched. They're all being batched through, a single procedure. Well, let me show you something here. I'm just going to give this a bit of a chop. And I need to work on this geometry because it still looks a bit basic here, so I will improve this before the final product. Every single piece of geometry that you see out there is dynamic and interactable. If I wanted, I could have them fall over, they could roll downhill with physics simulations. Every single bush, every single tree that you see can be chopped down. So they are not statically batched. They are rendered as they are as billboards, and you can see, I'll walk on over there. Am I running or walking? Let's see, I'll go to run here. You can see you can see the transitions as they're flicking between the various levels of detail here. So let's go ahead and walk through. And you can see it makes the environment feel so alive because there's so much more breakage to the line. It's my design philosophy I call breaking the line. If you have a landscape that's just a flat line, it's very dull, it's not interesting. And so your job as a visual designer is to break that line. Look at my scene here. Do you see any straight lines? Any straight horizontal lines? There isn't a single straight horizontal line, and that's what makes it look visually interesting and organic. All of these things were visible from a distance, but we were just seeing billboards drawn. The billboards, again, were employing subsurface scattering and normal data so that they're able to look good from a distance. You see the frame rate drop a little bit as I get closer, and it's drawing the very high resolution of these trees. But again, my capture card is not a good quality one, and the frame rate is much better if I were not using this capture card. So you can see it's quite dense. I ran down from the hill. Now I'm here, and you can see that using billboards gives you so much more opportunities to build an interesting environment. I'm going to see if I can find a particular environment here. Here we are. Because I've used billboards for my distant trees, it means that I can have environments like this. Whereas I think, unfortunately, because in Scarlet and Violet they are not using billboards, what I've noticed is their trees are still doing all those expensive calculations. They are still having to calculate wind because I see wind being drawn quite distant. And I think it would be a good idea for any future endeavors is to employ a different solution for rendering foliage in the distance, because it opens up so much more possibilities for level design. So this is the culmination of years and years of trying to figure out what goes right and what goes wrong with all of these things. And it's just things like this, where you have the light subsurface scattering, the light showing through your leaves, your sunbeam or sun rays coming through the leaves like that is what creates something interesting. But you can see I share something with the Scarlet and Violet games, is I don't actually have real volumetric lighting. I actually need to have the sun within view, and that gives that sense of atmospheric depth, of moisture in the atmosphere. I also employ global fog, so it looks like we're using a combination of similar techniques, which again is a design and performance consideration. Something that I would like to see in future Pokemon games is the use of tessellation on the terrain. That is what it's a rendering technique that allows the terrain to have basically bumpiness data from a specified material. So, for example, I say that, I want my roots to stick up out of the ground so that it's interesting to look at, so there's depth. And I'm fine-tuning the quality on that, and I'm just lowering the quality a bit here and there because I need to maintain a smooth frame. There's so many design considerations that come into it. And you can see that the roots sticking up just a bit makes the environment feel more organic and interesting. But there's so many things to consider, as having these rocks sort of interfere with that, and I have to render at a lower resolution because, again, performance implications. But this is basically these tie into the points. They help me more clearly express what I was trying to say. So I'll go ahead and switch back to the Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Let's go ahead and switch back now. Okay, so something from a business standpoint as well. I mean, it's not my place to discuss any sort of business considerations, but something that we saw that brought significant criticism upon Game Freak in the way that they handled the launch of the games here is people said, why are Pokemon missing from the Dex? How come we don't have a complete Pokedex anymore? And I think the answer that Game Freak gave was very unfortunate. Again, this is not my place to really comment. Oh, sorry about that, I bumped my microphone. But what really went wrong was their answer. Their answer to the situation was, we're creating, we're improving all the animations, we're creating all the animations. But then people showed examples that the animations for the Pokemon, many of the animations came directly from the previous games, and that there were not actual improvements to many of the animations. They were still the old animations from the old games, and that resulted in backlash. People were upset because that answer, it wasn't what people believed to be honest, and it really wasn't a sufficient answer that people were willing to accept. And it's so unfortunate that Game Freak already had a better answer. They just didn't give that better answer. And I don't understand why. And I think it would be a good idea for Game Freak to consider these kinds of situations, because this will happen in the future. People will draw more criticism upon future releases, and I would love to see Game Freak better prepared to deal with that criticism. And the answer that Game Freak already had that they could have given was, we're redoing the visuals for all of these Pokemons, their textures. We're redoing all of the textures by hand, and it takes a lot of time to do that. So we want to spend time improving the textures of every single Pokemon, and we want to reintroduce those Pokemon to you in a way that is exciting and interesting, so you can have new adventures with them. That is how I would have handled the situation if I were on sort of an advisory board with Game Freak. That's the answer I would have given, and that's not anything that I've made up. That is the truth of the situation. is Game Freak has improved every single texture for these Pokemon because they've added details to the fur, and it's not just textures in terms of the detail maps, it is normal data. Pokemon now have normal data, they have specular data, and these are not things that you can feed into an AI and say, hey, make this better for me. There's no plugin that you can put into Maya or Photoshop to make this happen. These things have to be done by hand. Artists have to spend time creating brand new textures, brand new materials for the Pokemon. So they've revised the visuals on every single Pokemon. So I don't understand why Game Freak handled the situation by communicating information that wasn't necessarily provable or visible, because people were proving that the animations were reused. So saying that the reason why Pokemon had to be taken out of the game or omitted from the game, why Pokemon were omitted from the game was because of animations, that was not an answer that helped the situation. That was an answer that made the situation significantly worse, and it led to criticism of Game Freak as a development studio when Game Freak already had a better answer. They had a very good answer, and that answer was they're improving the visuals. They're redoing the textures on every single Pokemon. They could have said that instead. They could have said, we want to reintroduce these Pokemon to you in an interesting and exciting way so you can have adventures with them again, as opposed to just transferring them from Pokemon Home. So again, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the game itself. That's more of a business standpoint. And I'm not, well, I say I'm not an advisor, but I am and have worked as a professional technology consultant, a digital technologies advisor on different boards for different industries in the past. So actually, I say it's not my place because that's not my focus of my business at the moment. Currently, I'm just focusing full-time on development, but in the past I have served as a public relations advisor and a public relations agent in the past. So it is work that I've done in the past, and being able to just help people understand where you're coming from and understanding where other people are coming from, especially your audience, your customers. You need to be able to understand their concerns and their thoughts, and you need to be able to address those concerns in a way that leads to a beneficial outcome for everyone. This is something that I think Game Freak has struggled with in the past, and I would love to see Game Freak coordinate with public relations in the future so that we don't end up in another situation where people build a sense of negativity towards these games, because I believe Game Freak and the development team and the planning team, everything about it, they have the absolute best of intentions with these games. To me, I've seen that they're really trying. They're really doing their best here. We're still seeing some things, like, for example, you've seen jittering. I've been trying to get it to happen. Jittering of the meshes in the distance. Sometimes when I quickly turn the camera, you'll see the terrain flicker. I'm not entirely sure why that is. I believe it is possibly due to the mesh portions of the terrain are streaming in, are loading in, and they are not able to load in fast enough before the camera is looking at that position. It is possible that there's a manual culling process going on, and that because of the lower frame rate as you turn, the culling logic happens too late and the terrain is culled. There's any number of things that could be going on, but I'm glad to see the game in this particular state. I can see that they have made so many significant changes, and I hope I didn't gloss over anything that I think is really important. Here's something that I've noticed as well. You can see the normal data, the bumpiness on this grass here is not something that I really noticed in the original launch. I think the terrain textures were lower pixel density and quite a bit splotchy on launch day. So this is something that I have seen improvements on. Anyway, I probably may have missed some things here or there. I just want to thank you for watching. If you are still enjoying these games, I would love to hear from you and to tell me what you've enjoyed. If there are differences that you've seen in these patches that I haven't seen, I'm not sort of fishing for engagement because I'm not a YouTube content creator. I'm genuinely interested in what all of you have to say about these games because I really respect the work that Game Freak has done on these. I've really enjoyed the time that I spent with this game, and I really only have positive things to say about this because it's been so much fun. And I like to see where the industry is going and where the series is going, as I grew up with this series, as I'm sure many of you have. And I fully believe and have faith that the next Pokemon games will be even better based on what we're seeing here. I'm sure we'll see them on the new Switch hardware, which I don't have any personal information about, but I'm confident that it's going to be something very exciting. So I'm looking forward to the future, and I need to get back to work on my own development. So thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been interesting to you. Please take care of yourselves. And if there's any other games that you would like to see me cover, please let me know. I was interested in sort of discussing the Batman game. I don't even know what the actual title is because I spend so much time on my own work, so I'm calling it the Batman game. But I was interested in covering that and the performance implications of that game and why it isn't running so great. I was interested in sort of Mortal Kombat, but again, I don't have time to play games these days because of my workload, and I don't necessarily want to buy a game full ticket just so I can do a YouTube video to do an analysis on it, because again, I'm not a YouTube content creator. I'm just a games developer, and I'm not necessarily interested in playing those games because I have extremely limited time to play games. And I can play a couple minutes of Smash Bros. Here and there while I'm waiting for my game engine to process my work, and that's about it. So, thanks for watching, take care of yourselves, and happy holidays to all of you.